The theme here is preserving and expanding agrobiodiversity, which is the whole collectivity, all of the diversity of all the plants and animals that we eat and that are important for food security. This is a really interesting slide. It says in 1903, commercial seed houses offered hundreds of varieties, as shown in this sampling of 10 crops. This was a study that looked at all the printed catalogs they could find from 1903, commercial seed houses, and they found 288 beet varieties and 544 cabbages and 497 lettuces. And then in 1983, just 80 years later, they looked in the National Seed Storage Laboratory, all the government collections, to see which of those still existed in those collections. And the numbers were staggeringly small. Of the 408 tomatoes, there are 79 left, and that's the most of any of them. Tomatoes are easy to save. They're self-pollinating crops. They don't outcross a lot, so it's relatively easy to save that. Lettuce is actually similar, but there's less striking diversity in lettuces, so from 497 varieties, we're down to 36, and that was 1983, so there could be even fewer.
I mean, I've noticed it personally from the seed companies.
Yeah.
From back in the 70s.
It's terrifying.
Things getting dwarfed.
A lot of those major important crops, really delicious, nutritious things are just gone. But it's not too late to salvage what we have. When you go to the supermarket, you see all of this diversity around. There's so many different brands and so many choices, it seems like. But it all boils down to putting money in the pockets of these same few major corporations. You know, you pick a favorite brand like Quaker Oats. Oh, that comes from Pepsi. And Cheerios, okay, that's General Mills.
I was in natural foods since the 70s, and it used to be a total diversification of small companies all around the country. And I saw a recent chart, and there's basically about 6 companies now that own all these brands that you buy and love so much now. Once the money became big enough in that industry, they just bought it up, you know?
Yeah. It's a real shame. I mean, even some things that, you know, that you think of as being a natural food.
They may keep some of the same people around or the same thing, but it does change after a while.
Yep. Cheerios used to be one of my favorite foods. I mean, from the time I was a kid, that was my snack food, handfuls of Cheerios. And I was really pleased when they announced that they were going to go GMO-free a few years ago. Pretty much it was just cornstarch. They needed to get GMO-free cornstarch, which wasn't that hard to do. But recently I started noticing that it was causing my mouth to burn, and I was like, I can't keep eating Cheerios anymore. And then I read a study that said that Cheerios tested highest for glyphosate, which is Roundup. And so yeah, they're GMO-free now, but it's still conventionally farmed. And grain farmers are using the herbicide Roundup on their oats and their wheats a week before they harvest, inevitably, because it kills any other weeds that are in the field. It makes it easier for their combine to get through it all. And yeah, it dries down the plant quicker. So
studies have shown 45% of our population has glyphosate in our...
It's terrifying. I just visited Don Huber out in Idaho, who's 82 years old and a whistleblower. He basically worked as a consultant for 20 years for Monsanto. He's a plant pathologist from Purdue, PhD, brilliant guy. Spent 40 years as an Army reservist doing science for their chemical weapons mitigation team. And he has been studying Roundup since it came out in the 70s and knows more about it than anybody. And you Google him now, and the first 10 pages that come up are all propaganda, smear campaign stuff saying this guy's a bioterrorist and all this. There's a lawsuit in California. If we didn't have Donald Trump as president right now, sucking up all the energy in the news media, it would have been a huge story. There's a class action lawsuit against Monsanto in California, 3,500 farmers with lymphoma who used a lot of Roundup. they probably have a 98% chance of winning. They've been covering it up. They've known that it's a carcinogen since the 80s. The FDA knew about that, and they conspired with Monsanto. I mean, it's just atrocious. Anyway, so the seed industry has really got the same consolidation issue that the food industry has. And each of these represents an individual label, an individual seed company that, you know, if you go to a garden store, you might buy those seeds, or if you go to a farm store, buy those seeds under that label. They're really all owned by the same few companies, and now, this was 2013, there's been more consolidation since this slide was made, so somebody's got to update it.
Aren't they trying to basically own all the seeds so that you have to buy their seed, which would be treated in some way or another?
Mm-hmm. It's part of their business model to buy up seed companies that have varieties that they sell and to take those off the market. Another thing they've done is, if you're a seed company and you're growing an open pollinated heirloom type variety, you need to select every year. If you're growing a radish and you want uniform radishes every year, you can't just grow out all those radishes, save all the seeds, and expect that the next year it's going to be okay. Because there's off types that need to be culled every year. You need to dig those radishes out of the ground, look for the ones that are the right size, the right shape, put them back in the ground, and only save seeds from those. So seed companies stopped doing that selection on a lot of the old open pollinated varieties. The idea, you know, whether it was intentional or not, that neglect caused people to look to their hybrids for more consistency. The consequence is, you know, you have something like Scarlet Knott's carrot is the most popular heirloom carrot on the market, sold by dozens of seed companies, maybe hundreds around the country, but they all look different, and none of them are uniform because there's been such poor selection done on those. You need to find a good strain from a good company like Meadowlark Hearth, a biodynamic company in western Nebraska. They have a strain of that Scarlet Knott's that they got from John Navazio. That is what that carrot is supposed to be like. They're supposed to be uniform. The flavor's supposed to be consistent. The color. There's seed companies selling multi-forked carrots now, and just ones that are come up a whole mess. So it takes work, and they make more money, you know, and they can keep a hybrid under wraps. If they release an open pollinated seed, everybody can start selling that a few years later. But if they have a hybrid, they keep the parent lines proprietary. Don't release those, only release the hybrids. And then you can't save those seeds.
So you're wanting to save seed.
Yeah.
You should actually do selection before you let them seed out, because once you've done that, they've crossed.
Exactly.
And you've kind of lost that.
Same with all of them, with beets, with cabbages, with really anything. You know, you want to make sure you're saving only from the best plants with the traits that you want to pass on. It's easier with some crops than others, but radishes is a relatively easy one. I'm going to talk about potatoes for a little bit. Anybody recognize that potato? That potato is called a lumper. The other name for it is Irish lumper. That was the only potato that they grew in Ireland, or the main potato grown that caused the potato famine. This is Peruvian potato diversity, and this is just a tiny snapshot of the total diversity that exists in Peru. That was the lumper. So it's a real simple concept. If you have a diverse lot of potatoes and a blight hits and it kills the susceptible ones, you're still going to have some left. With all clonal, all the same, you're going to lose them all. And that's exactly what happened in Ireland. Most people don't realize that it's pretty easy to create more potato diversity by saving true seeds from potatoes. They make berries that look just like little eggplants or tomatoes. They have seeds inside them, and you can grow them just like a tomato. That's a seedling potato that we grew a few years ago. We got really some interesting potatoes, like those kind of splotchy pink ones.
Yeah, gorgeous.
Kind of tan on the inside. And this is another one.
Penta.
They were small, but pretty cool.
Yeah.
The basic theme of this part of the talk is how I got a collection of seeds like this and how we continue to find more things to do our research on. After I go through a bunch of stories here, I'm going to dive into the USDA resources, which are available to all of us for free, and hardly anybody takes advantage of them. So it's really an important part of my personal mission to get people liberating seeds from those collections, because they're not doing any good sitting in a freezer. They got to get out there. They got to be selected. They've got to adapt to this changing climate. You know, you have a seed that was put in a freezer 50 years ago. It might still be good, but you know, if it was from New Jersey and you take it out in today's New Jersey, it's a whole different climate already, and it's only getting worse. So seeds need to be out there. One of the seeds that we sell, we call it Dietrich's Wild Broccoli Raab. And this is the farm in New Jersey, the Dietrich's farm. When Dusty and I first got there in 2014, we were living in a busted old RV and a tent and cooking on a Coleman stove. And the Dietrich said, hey, you should be eating that wild broccoli raab. You know, save money on food. You don't need to refrigerate it. It's just growing everywhere. And we said, wild broccoli raab, what are you even talking about? They pointed out where in the field we could find it, and we went and found it. And it became pretty clear after studying the plant for a year or two that this is a feral turnip, essentially. It's some kind of Italian leaf turnip or combination of turnips that went wild in South Jersey decades, if not a century ago, and naturalized. And now it's a biennial plant that produces these flower spikes incredibly early. I have no doubt that when I get back to New Jersey, there's already going to be some in bloom because it's been so warm. This is a whole handful of broccoli raab spikes. And you can see in the background in the hedgerow, there's no green leaves yet. I mean, this was the end of winter, and we're already harvesting this stuff. So that's become a really popular seed. People are really interested in that. I think it has a lot of potential as a crop. It's like a hunger gap crop. We eat that for a month before the asparagus and the rhubarb start popping. It's crazy, and it's delicious and nutritious. You know, there's probably some powerful genes in that population as well against the native pests like the harlequin beetle that devastates our cabbage crops in the midsummer and our kale. That's my niece and a rhubarb plant. We're selling seeds from that plant. Basically, this rhubarb, I go into in detail on the website about this story, but basically a friend of my family, her parents passed away. They were in their 90s. They had a farmhouse up in the Pocono Mountains in northern Pennsylvania. I remembered going there as a kid because they had these huge blueberry bushes, and I loved picking the blueberries there. The daughter-in-law said that she's sure that there's a rhubarb plant still somewhere in their yard. So we drove over there once when I was visiting, and I was looking at the May apples in the back. That's where those May apples came from that you saw already. And she was pacing around the lawn, which had been mowed every week by, you know, or every 2 weeks to keep the grounds looking good. And finally, she found these like pencil-thin stems with silver dollar-sized leaves at the end and said, oh, here's the rhubarb. It had survived under the mower blades and kept growing. So we stuck the shovel in the ground, and it had this massive root ball. There were a couple of growing points, so I split it up, planted it out in a garden at my friend's house, and then subsequently we split it again, and now we have quite a few plants. I've got a friend growing some in Baltimore. I sent some to my sister, who's growing it out in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and it doesn't bloom for us in New Jersey. We've never seen it send up a flower spike, but 2 years in Michigan, and it sent up this huge flower spike. As you can see by the leaves, and those leaves are some of the biggest rhubarb leaves I've ever seen. The stems are really thick, but the most valuable thing about it for us is Japanese beetles don't like it. We have 3 or 4 other rhubarb varieties, and we grow them all near each other, and in the summer the Japanese beetles come and they just defoliate the rhubarbs, but they don't touch this one. So there's something going on there, and we sell the seeds because we've got thousands of seeds from that one plant. Rhubarb won't grow true to seed. It won't grow exactly like that, but you know, there'll be different combinations of genes, and there's surely going to be some interesting ones out of that population. It's delicious. I mean, it tastes. I don't notice too much variation in the tastes of rhubarbs, but I love it. I mean, I love making pies and everything else you do with rhubarb, sauces and jams. And this is the KC-146 tomato, which I mentioned to some of you. That was the original Campbell Soup tomato. Campbell's had a big breeding program in South Jersey. They're based in Camden. They're still based in Camden, but all the local farms there grew for Campbell's back in the day. So we have an okra variety that they must have used for gumbo. This is the tomato that was probably in the Campbell's Soup can during the Andy Warhol era. But it's been preserved locally in South Jersey as a treasured heirloom. You can still find local gardeners mainly growing it, and Rutgers continues to maintain it and distribute seeds every year. So we really love that one. Great flavor, great canning tomato. This is Clackamas blueberry tomato, it's called, and this is the blue-green zebra. You may have noticed these blue tomatoes starting to show up. Indigo rose was the first one, and indigo apple. Basically, some plant breeders in Oregon State, led by Jim Myers, crossed a wild Galapagos tomato species, literally, Solanum cheesemanii, something like that, with conventional tomatoes. They cross easily. And those tomatoes have genes for high anthocyanin content, and that was transferred to the tomatoes. So that blue pigment on it is antioxidants, and it's a way to make tomatoes healthier. First ones that came out I don't think tasted any good, but now that the genes are out there and people are playing with them, they're all over. So this was bred by Tom Wagner, who's the guy who released the original green zebra tomato 35 years ago. And now he has this one he calls the blue-green zebra tomato. And he did the other one too, the Clackamas blueberry. And these taste delicious. This pepper is a Zipser Turkenspitz. It means Turk's shoe, that's the Turkenspitz. And Zipser is from the Zip people. The Zips were a German-speaking minority group in Slovakia. They pretty much don't live there anymore after World War II. At the end of the war, I think they were all kicked out. William Woys Weaver, who's one of my mentors and wrote a book about heirloom vegetable gardening. He's one of the people who popularized that term, heirloom vegetable. He was given this, I believe, in Vienna, given the seeds in the 80s by a woman descended from the Zips, and has been preserving it ever since. It actually ripens to a nice orange red. It's a beautiful, sweet pepper.
You mean that's green? Wow.
That's a sweet pepper, and that's not ripe yet. Again, that purple color is anthocyanins. That's antioxidants. This is a lima bean from Ethiopia. And it's really interesting because lima beans originated in South America, Central America maybe, but they've spread around the world. And some of the most interesting diversity comes from the other side of Africa. There's ones that look a lot like this on Madagascar as well. So you can almost trace the trade routes based on where these beans ended up. I've heard that they have high cyanide content and that they were primarily used ceremonially, these ones. They're not food beans, but it's a perennial in tropical climates, and it may be possible to process that cyanide out. This one might not have it. I'm not sure, but it certainly is beautiful.
So how are you testing? Will you send it to the government? How are you testing?
This one we can't grow in New Jersey. At this point, we're not testing them at all. We're just not eating them if we have any kind of doubt about it. But we plan to, we're building relationships with universities and places like that. The government doesn't have the budget for it, unfortunately. And this goes into it a little bit. I added some slides from the last week from my trip out west.
Nate, is that the same lima bean as the Christmas lima bean?
No, Christmas lima bean is adapted for here. Okay. If you look closely, the modeling is very different. It's more consistent. Like this always has that half solid red, okay, and then the other half splattered. There's crazy diversity in all of these things. I mean, there are probably 2,000–3,000 existing lima beans out there. Wow. And we're only growing a fraction of them. This is a horned melon. You may have seen these in the supermarket selling for like $7 a fruit, trying to convince people that it's a superfruit. Maybe it is, but it's a fruit like any other. It's in the cucumber melon family. Most of them, if you just get one from the supermarket and try and grow the seeds, or if you get one from a seed company, it's adapted for Africa. This one traveled around the world. People were playing with it in Russia for a while. Then it was maintained in the Netherlands for a while. So it's adapted for the north after 40 years in various collections. We grew this one in New Jersey and it grew just fine. This is one of the cowpeas that we have, the Tetapeche gray mottled cowpea. It's from northern Mexico, near the desert southwest here. But interestingly, it looks almost identical and behaves almost the same as an heirloom from Botswana, the gray Palapai cowpea. We have both of them. It's native to Africa, but it found its way to North America. That one is probably more desert adapted, and the Palapai can handle a moister climate. This is an eggplant from China. It's a really early eggplant. Basically, we grew that one because William Moyes Weaver asked me if I would request some seeds from the government. He was looking for something called the Fu Chao round eggplant. He said it's an early Chinese eggplant. So I looked through the government database to find every early round Chinese eggplant that I could find, and I requested about 30 different varieties. And we grew a bunch of them to see which ones just would do okay. Will was interested in finding this specific one, I think because to see which would match a picture he had from some old document. But we just wanted something that would grow well and be early. This one, again, high anthocyanins from all that purple color in the stem and in the leaves. Eggplants are considered long season crops. This one you can direct seed in the ground and a couple months later have eggplants growing on it. And it stood up relatively well to the flea beetles well, but you can still see quite a few holes in those leaves there. But because it grows so fast, it can spit off some fruit before you get the beetle pressure.
What's that variety called?
That's called Chiyae, Chiyaei. And I don't think that the seeds are available anywhere right now. We had a crop failure last year because I assumed it was a turkey came and ripped up every plant early in the season. Could have been a groundhog. It seemed like turkey. It was like right by a turkey trail. But well, we should have more next year because we're going to do a better job of growing that out. We do have another early eggplant that's from Afghanistan. It's a pale green, thinner one that's also really early from Kandahar, Afghanistan. This is another cool one I got out of the USDA. It's a cucumber that's about 19 inches long. It's called a Gagon, G-A-G-O-N. You can eat it when it's this big. The flesh still tastes good. It's almost more like a melon texture. Great for juicing. And when it's small, it's a normal looking green cucumber. It's really tasty. Yeah. This is a really interesting plant, not a seed, obviously, but this is white turmeric. Basically, I found these tubers at an Indian market in New Jersey. You know, they were tubers, so they were clearly still alive. And I said, oh, well, maybe I can plant this and grow it. That's at my friend's house in Baltimore. He's been growing it better than I have actually down there. Even some of this tropical stuff, if you have access to a greenhouse, or even if you just have a house with a south-facing window and you can take it indoors.
Going dormant?
They will go dormant as well, yeah. Things like this, you put it in the ground, it'll get big in the summer. I go to farmers markets and see people selling turmeric now regularly. I met up with my friend Glenn Tevis, who's from Hawaii, and it's hard to see the color on this, but that's green turmeric, really green on the inside. Probably the same species as the Zedwari, not the Curcuma longa, which is the turmeric species, but it's used medicinally. Some people eat it. I've read they eat thin slices of it with salt every day.
Not quite as medicinally strong because it doesn't have the color.
It's going to be differently strong. It's going to have different compounds. It smells different, so I'm sure there's a lot of the chemical footprint is different. What was that?
Peel it before you?
Probably, but I mean, I haven't eaten this. We're saving every piece that we got to grow more, so I'll eat some maybe in a couple of years. One of the things that we do a lot of is try and specifically grow plants from communities that are under threat, whether by war, rising sea levels, poverty. You know, a lot of people are leaving rural areas for urban areas, in some cases depopulating entire countries. This is melon from the Maldives, which are low-lying islands in the Indian Ocean. They're going to be one of the first countries to disappear completely in the next 50 years. And it's a really interesting melon. It was clearly bred for the gel around the seeds and not for the flesh, like most melons. When it's young, it actually can be treated just like a cucumber. It tastes like a cucumber. It looks like a cucumber. Eventually, when it gets fully ripe, it splits open like that. I think they may have used it for a base for making alcohol. I wouldn't be surprised if they've used it as animal feed because it's really productive, creates a lot of biomass, a lot of nutrition.
Is the gel sweet?
It's not sweet. It's a little bit sour, a little bit melony flavored. It's pretty bland. We posted this picture on Instagram and it was, I think, our second most popular picture ever because nobody's ever seen anything that looks like that. And someone commented from Indonesia and said that they have melons just like that in Indonesia. Right. That it's like a cucumber when it's young. And she said they mix that gel with sweet fruits and sugar and bulk it up. And I wouldn't be surprised if you could use that flesh in cooking applications like a vine peach melon, which is a little yellow melon that is used as a pie melon. If you 50-50 with apples, you won't realize that there's any melon in there, but it gets you some different nutrition. This is that Moldovan green tomato. Moldova is a country, probably still the poorest country in Europe. People are just fleeing over the last 20, 30 years, fleeing the rural areas for the city, fleeing the whole country for other countries in Europe. You know, an entire agricultural culture is dying. This is a relatively popular tomato in this country. It's one of the best tasting green ripening tomatoes.
How do you know when it's ripe?
You can tell. The color goes a little darker, a little yellower, and you can just see it. Once you grow it, and that one feel, it's delicious. It's just fantastic. The next few are all from the city of Homs in Syria, which is one of the cities that's been most devastated by the war. This is an eggplant, and I got all those seeds from the USDA. They've had plant explorers out there for the last century getting seeds from all around the world, and that's a delicious one. It's real meaty. It stands up well to cooking. It doesn't get spongy.
Do you have a perennial eggplant? I know you mentioned that.
Oh, we don't. This is an annual, not a perennial, but there's still some people working with perennial eggplants, and in tropical climates there are perennial eggplants already. This one still has some wild characteristics. I don't know if you can see it on this picture, but it's got the occasional spine on the cap that can be a real sharp thorn. Really tasty. This is a tomato from Homs as well. This is what they call Homs 11. It's got that beautiful bright red color and those deep ribs. It's really easy to just rip off a chunk and save the rest for later. This has got a real acidic flavor. I love it. Great sauce tomato. This is a squash from Homs. It's like a Kusa type zucchini. When it's small, it's got the best flavor of any zucchini, real buttery, and it doesn't get like a giant baseball bat, big green baseball bat like most of our zucchini. It matures to about this big and white. And for the first week or two when it's full sized, it's still edible and delicious. It's, you know, we slice it and use it like eggplant. You can cut out the middle and stuff it. You can just, you know, julienne it and make fries with it. It's really a versatile zucchini. But it grows on a long trailing vine. It's not like these modern bush types. No, it's a pepo. And there's a little variation in that population as well. Occasionally we get ones that are different forms because, you know, a lot of these land races, which I'll talk about what a land race is, they've never been stabilized. They've never been, you know, commercially bred. But there's strength in that diversity.
So how long might it grow?
Distance-wise? Yeah, it could crawl about 10 feet, but usually less than that, maybe 6. But it's really drought tolerant because it's from the desert. It's really wonderful. And this is a Homs watermelon, which has got these beautiful seeds, which have a little black line around the edge. And that pink flesh, it's variable. Sometimes it's pretty bland, but it's much firmer than most of the watermelons that we have. I suspect it was probably used for preserving, like you can make candy with it, and some of them are really sweet and delicious. We have all these seeds from Syria, and there was an article in The Guardian about us a few years ago, and somebody saw it who was a relief worker in Lebanon, and she travels back and forth a lot, and she had friends who were going back to Lebanon to a Syrian refugee camp, and said, you know, give me some of your Syrian seeds and I'll take them to some Syrian people who really want to grow them. She's actually a French woman in the picture, but this is in a refugee camp in Lebanon, and they're growing that Holmes tomato, and this is actually sorghum from South Sudan. It's not indigenous to Syria or to that region, but people are familiar with it there, and it's an incredibly nutritious, easy to grow food in the desert. They were quite happy with it, but they loved the tomato. That was a tomato that people recognized but didn't have seeds for or any way to grow it. I'm going to talk a little bit about land races. Is anybody familiar with that term from before today? This definition says it's a dynamic population of a cultivated plant that has historical origin, distinct identity, and lacks formal crop improvement, as well as often being genetically diverse, locally adapted, and associated with traditional farming systems. A little more complicated definition is this: a landrace of a seed-propagated crop can be defined as a variable population which is identifiable and usually has a local name. It lacks formal crop improvement, is characterized by a specific adaptation to the environmental conditions of the area, and is closely associated with the traditional uses, knowledge, habits, dialects, and celebrations of the people who developed and continue to grow it. In most traditional cultures around the world, landrace agriculture is what they practice. They're saving seeds themselves. Maybe they're pooling seeds with their neighbors and growing them out, or they're growing seeds that they buy from a local farm store that were produced locally in the area. This is that landrace Kandahar okra. You know, you plant a whole packet of those seeds and you could get this amount of diversity if you go out and harvest one day. Some plants are mostly red, some are mostly white, some are fat, some are thin, some are curved, some are stubby, some have sharp spines on them, and some don't. They're all delicious. For breeders, you know, for plant breeders, a population like this is incredibly valuable because there's things for you to select from. If this is a place where it's kind of challenging to grow okra in some places, you know, you plant these, they all might not do well, but if you only save seeds from the ones that do the best, within a couple of generations, you're going to have your own landrace adapted to this area. And that's what we need to get more and more people doing, farmers and gardeners alike. This is the Nanticoke squash. The Nanticoke people are indigenous to southeastern Maryland along the eastern shore and southern Delaware. They've now spread around North America. They don't have a reservation, but there's still communities in Delaware and in South Jersey as well. A number of them moved to New Jersey and kind of merged with the local Lenni Lenape tribes there. This squash has largely been lost. As far as I know, Nanticoke people are not still cultivating it anywhere. But Seed Savers Exchange got a hold of those seeds from the Abundant Life Foundation, who got a hold of them from who knows where decades ago. And I got the seeds about a decade ago myself out of the Seed Savers vault and started growing them because I knew that they were local to my area. And I thought it would be interesting. And the first couple of years, I only had a tiny postage stamp backyard in a row house. I got one plant that made fruit that looked like that one. I was diligent about hand pollinating. The next year, I gave some to some friends, and she got ones that looked like that and that looked like that. And I said, okay, this is a little more interesting than I thought. And then when we got to the farm and were able to grow a lot of it, we realized that there was a staggering amount of diversity in this population. And it is a true landrace. It has identifiable characteristics, even though it looks like a jumble. When you actually are familiar with the plant and You know, you've seen it year after year. You realize that these are just variations on a theme. And some of them have more of this turban type.
Yeah, and the big
Sometimes the turban is smaller, the big orange one. And the other thing that's fascinating about this, the government is doing a study right now of Maxima squash genetics. This is a Maxima, trying to trace their spread around the world. It's believed that this species originated in Argentina, that's where the wild Maximas are, and that it didn't reach North America until after Columbus. So this population existed in southern Delaware or eastern Maryland, and that area, the Chesapeake and the Delaware Bay, those were two of the centers of global trade in the 1600s, 1700s. So it's, and some of these squash, I've had one keep on my counter for 18 months. So, you know, these are probably loaded onto ships and went around the world as food. And then the seeds were saved, they were planted in other countries, and now they've come back to this country as other countries' heirlooms. So you know, we see things that, this looks like a red curry squash, which is a Japanese heirloom.
This one down here looks like a Long Island cheese kind of.
Exactly. Well, that's a moschata, but so it's probably not related. But this one here looks like a Turk's turban, which is a French heirloom. These blue ones look like a Queensland Blue or a Jarrahdale, which is an Australian heirloom Maxima. This one has that triangular shape. Some of them have that tri-lobed, which is also typical of an Australian heirloom. So we think that this population is probably the progenitor of a lot of the heirloom squash from around the world. And the first few years I was trying to kind of select some of my favorite types and see if I could get them to come back, but I have never really succeeded in that at all. It probably takes at least a decade to do that, but I'm pretty convinced that the diversity is the main strength of this variety. I love planting it and not knowing what I'm gonna get. They're just, I mean, this one here with these like gold splotches was just gorgeous and just delicious. They're all different.
It's like they've got all the colors in the paint palette in there.
All right in there, and the flavors too. I mean, some of them are not sweet at all. Some of them are a little watery. Very few are bland, but I could probably guess that this one doesn't taste very good. These smaller, rounder ones are usually not very good, but I don't save seeds from them. I'm maintaining it as I imagine the indigenous people maintained it. They saved seeds from the biggest, the most productive, the best ones. They didn't care about uniformity, they just cared about productivity, flavor, storability. So, you know, I save seeds, I let them sit around for months and months and months, and the ones that last the longest, those are my stock for the next year.
So the diversity is in the seeds.
It's, yep.
So the differing conditions that they encounter may produce something slightly different each season.
Absolutely. Some years we have ones that are covered in warts, and then the next year none are covered in warts.
Oh, I love it.
It's really interesting. This is just a snapshot too. If you go online and do a search for this one, we've posted a lot of pictures of different types. There's really beautiful ones. Strawberry shaped, covered in warts, blue ones and pink ones. And I just love this the sunny side gets pink and the shady side stays blue. It's just stunning.
Are the blue ones denser and sweeter?
The blue ones are generally denser and sweeter. The gray ones, blue ones, some of these orange, pink ones are often the best tasting ones. This splotchy one here is the same as that one. That was the same plant. Those were delicious as well. And I like to slice it and fry it. I like to steam it. I make gnocchi out of the flesh, just flour and squash flesh is delicious.
How is it with powdery mildew or valley?
The mildews haven't been a problem for it, and it seems well adapted to vine borer as well. It is susceptible to it, but it doesn't generally kill the plant. We've had it where, and actually a lot of those plants, if you look closely at them, I dug out a worm from the top of the fruit because You know, that thing climbed all the way into the fruit and then it couldn't get any further because the flesh is too dense. The plant survived that and the fruit ripened to produce more seeds. So, you know,
Cover the stems here and there?
not hardly at all. We have too much going on to really do that. But last year, all of our squash failed. Probably some kind of bacterial wilt or something really quickly, or it could have been related to dicamba or some kind of pesticide drift from somewhere else, because it was within about 3 days and it was multiple species just crapped out. That was the first time that happened. So this year we're not going to grow any squash at the field, take a break from it. Whatever pest is there, hopefully we, you know, it'll die in a year or two, and then we'll try again. But luckily we have multiple spaces to farm now, so we can grow them elsewhere. And I live about 5 minutes from the farm. I didn't plant any Nanticoke, but one grew out of my compost, a couple grew out of my compost, and I knew exactly what they were because it's the only Maxima that I grow. And one of them made these big, beautiful, almost ribbed squash that are also delicious. And I still have one hanging around, so they're good keepers. So again, on the landrace front, these are some landrace wheats collected in Turkey in 2012. Turkey still has a huge amount of biodiversity, agrobiodiversity, that's really important to preserve. These are corns from Mexico, just a snapshot. There's so many more. Corn is maybe the most diverse cultivated plant on the planet. This is what you might call a modern landrace, like the emerald okra that we're selling, the Jersey Emerald. This was a population created by folks at Adaptive Seeds. I think that some of this came from Frank Morton, Wild Garden Seeds, and maybe from Tim Peters as well. And they sell these seeds as Kale Coalition. You plant those seeds and you can get any of that and more. For breeders, you can pick some great stuff. I think there's a new kale called Dazzling Blue that I believe came out of this population. A guy named Hank Keogh, who worked for Wild Garden Seed, developed this, and it's now becoming a really popular kale variety. It's like a dinosaur kale with a purple rib. Crop wild relatives are wild relatives of crop plants. I think this is Maximilian, which is a wild North American sunflower, closely related to our domesticated sunflower, which is maybe the most important domesticated indigenous crop in North America, and now is grown all over the world.
But Maximilian wouldn't have any food or...
It has tiny seeds.
Right.
So the people at the Land Institute are working on developing ones with bigger seeds that could be used as an oilseed crop. Some of these crop wild relatives are really valuable, have really important genes in them. Like this Pecos sunflower has salinity tolerance, and that could be bred into cultivated sunflowers. Eastern filbert blight resistance comes from the American filbert, which is not a really useful hazelnut, but the genes are really useful in the cultivated hazelnuts. We can use this wild California walnut as rootstock for other walnuts that can stand up to dry, hot better. And the western corn rootworm resistance can be bred into corn from this eastern gamma grass. It's taken a long time for scientists to learn about all these relations, but it's there. This is a wild grass that's close to corn, another wild grass that's close to wheat. These are tiny little wild beans, and then another wild sunflower. And this map is really interesting. This shows global hotspots of crop wild relatives that are assessed as being in urgent need of further collecting to improve their representation in gene banks. The areas that are yellow, orange, red are the places with the highest concentration of underrepresented species. Spain, Portugal, France, Turkey, Italy, Borneo, Sumatra, Brazil, but don't neglect those yellow spots and those green spots in the US. I think we're right in one of them. There are all kinds of crop wild relatives around here that are just not preserved in gene banks, and there's not enough money to make these things happen.